All right, welcome. We want to welcome you to the Black Power Blueprint and to tonight's webinar, The History of Black St. Louis. We want to start off by just giving a salute, a shout out to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who is the visionary for the Black Power Blueprint, and to Deputy Chair Onazane Yeshitela, who is the architect of the Black Power Blueprint, who came to St. Louis, sat here in this above 100-degree building all throughout the summer with no bathroom, no air, did the same thing in the winter with no heat, just to make this happen on the ground here every day in this building that we renovated as part of the Black Power Blueprint, and she is the architect indeed. We want to recognize them. And then, you know, we just want to say welcome again. This is the Black Power Blueprint, tonight's webinar, The History of St. Louis. So we are moving into phase 2 of the Black Power Blueprint. If you have not been following us, phase 1 was a renovation of this beautiful building that you can kind of see behind us. So that is completed. Now we're moving into phase 2, where we're demolishing 2 buildings, and we'll be turning those properties, those spaces, into an outdoor market for vendors to come and be able to keep commerce in the African community. We're also renovating housing as part of phase 2, so that organizers and people coming home from prison who will participate in our phase 3 program, which is a community commercial kitchen, will have a place to stay as we really struggle to push back gentrification and fight for black self-determination. So we want to welcome you again. I wanted to introduce you to our speakers. Immediately to my right, we have Isoke Kenyatta Bell. She is on the Black Power Blueprint Steering Committee. Let's give her a hand. And to the right of Isoke is Brandy Arrington. And to her right, Zion Farmer, also both on the Black Power Blueprint Steering Committee. So we just want to welcome our guests, and we want to thank you. And at this time, I want to turn it over to Isoke.
Okay. Ihuru Ticharwa, we'll talk to you about the history of Black St. Louis. To a lot of people in this country and around the world, St. Louis is known as the gateway to the West and was once one of the top largest 5 cities in the U.S. They brag about the 1904 World's Fair held here, which was the first World's Fair held outside of Europe. But in terms of African people, we have a different experience, a different point of view. Can you talk about the founding of St. Louis, the black experience, and our history of resistance as African people going back to the 1800s?
Yeah, so first off, we don't know who founded a name of the person or persons who founded this part of the world that we call the Americas, because it was the indigenous people who lived here first and foremost. But the first Europeans who came here were a mixture of the Spanish early on, then the French, and then the British, who would later become Americans. And so 1764 that we are told that Laclede and Choteau, some people say Chateau, settled and colonized this area. They were enslavers. They killed indigenous people in order to make it happen. And they showed up around 1764. And then 1804, we see Lewis and Clark, who we're told were explorers, in our history classes. They tell us these were great explorers, but in fact, they were 2 military officers acting as spies. Exactly. That was their job. So when we are told that they explored or went west, they went west to spy on the indigenous people who might impede their ability to take more land, and to other European forces that had a stake in taking the land before other so-called Americans would get to it. So they were spies. They left from a place not too far from here called Fort Bell Fountain. In Bell Fountain, people know of Bell Fountain, Missouri, or Bell Fountain in Illinois. So they left from Bell Fountain. It was a fortress. It was a place that they provided soldiers, guns, ammunition, and intelligence for these spies who would go west to take more land from the indigenous people. So from Fort Bell Fountain, interestingly enough, that fortress moved its location to another spot in St. Louis on a street referred to as Arsenal. And so I grew up in St. Louis, not knowing about the street Arsenal, but I never knew that Arsenal was called Arsenal because it was the location of an actual arsenal. So this fortress was moved to this arsenal location, and it was this arsenal location that would eventually become the home of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, which is a modern day spy agency all over Africa, all over the so-called Middle East, providing intelligence to allow U.S. imperialism to be able to target and bomb people. And so Lewis and Clark played a significant role in that whole colonial process because they were the initial spies. And it would later be balloons that would go up in the air initially before airplanes and that kind of thing. They would send balloons up in the air, and then they would be able to look out, a mile or two to survey the land. They were surveying the land. That's important too. And then they could know how to aggress upon the indigenous people. So they facilitated this whole process beginning in 1804. The other thing that's significant for African people is that it was 1804 that the so-called British colonists here would create this new country that they would call the United States of America. And they acquired it, it was as stolen property from the French, who sold it for little or nothing. And the French sold this property because it was the African people in what we call Haiti that defeated Napoleon, that defeated the French, that forced the French to then have to sell property in order to raise money, because they, just like they do today, just like the United States does today, they rely on the exploitation of African people and other indigenous people all over the planet to maintain their social system. And so the loss of Haiti by the French as a colony required them to sell this stolen territory to what would become the United States. And so when we talk about St. Louis being the gateway to the West, it was really the gateway to westward aggression by Europeans.
Thank you, Ticharwa, for that compelling history of
And,
St. Louis.
as we move forward too, we really want to bring this home and make this concrete. What we're trying to do is show the relationship between the conditions of African people today based upon what happened early on. And we are really struggling to fight against this social system by building the Black Power blueprint right on the ground here. So what you see right now is an anti-colonial project. And we need you to participate in this project by giving online. You can go to www.ucaring.com/Black Power Blueprint. And you can donate. And you can also subscribe to the Black Power Blueprint on YouTube, Black Power Blueprint, so that you can get notifications every time we go live.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Uhuru, Ticharwa. I'm going to turn my attention to Brandy. Okay. Brandy, I want you to speak more about the African resistance here in St. Louis. I want to welcome you and your beautiful son, Zion. Brandy is a member of the St. Louis Black Power Steering Committee and the Black Power Blueprint. Now, Brandy, I know that you are a lifelong resident of St. Louis and a mother with a full-time job and starting a new business. Ooh. With all that going on, Brandy, can you tell us why did you choose to homeschool your son, Zion?
Uhuru. Well, it wasn't a hard decision. Zion actually kind of made it himself because he questioned and challenged everything that he learned at school. So there just came a point where, he and I both united that was the way to go. But in our homeschool curriculum, we do things a little bit differently. We, of course, we adhere to the Common Core curriculum, but at the same time, we are able and entitled to add in pieces of our own. And one of those subjects is called Our History. Our history allows for Zion to learn about the self-determination of Africans that came before him and came before us and that have been fighting since the beginning of time. Two of those are local. They are John Meacham and also his wife, Mary Meacham. So Mary Meacham, she was enslaved in St. Louis. she and her husband John, they had a safe place that was on the route for the Underground Railroad. After her husband passed, she continued that safe place for enslaved Africans that were trying to get from the south to the north. Something that's interesting about her, though, is that in 1855, she was charged with slave theft for trying to help 9 Africans escape from enslaved territory in Missouri on a ferry across the Mississippi to Illinois, which was a free state. Zion, do you think that you can help me tell everybody about what we've learned about the husband, John Berry Meacham?
He learned to be a carpenter while he was enslaved.
Okay, so while he was still enslaved, he learned how to be a carpenter. What did he use, or what did he buy with the money that he made as a carpenter?
He bought his wife and himself freedom.
So he bought the freedom for himself and his wife, huh?
Yes.
Okay, so tell me, in 1947, the state of Missouri, they banned Africans from being educated. Did that stop John Berry Meacham?
No, it did not stop him from teaching African people to read.
Oh, okay. So if there was a ban, how did he go about teaching African people to read?
He did it on a school boat.
A school boat? I've never heard of a school boat before. That's crazy. So this school boat, where was it?
It was on the Mississippi River.
So just right flat in the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
But that makes sense, because we know that the Mississippi River was neutral territory because it was in the middle of Missouri, which was a
slave state.
A slave state, and Illinois, which was a
free state.
free state. Good job, Zion. So just one more question for you. Can you remember the name of the school boats?
It was called the Floating Freedom School.
Good job, Zion.
Young freedom fighter. Okay, well, now we're going to bring our attention to Jawanza Iyele, who was going to interview Ticharwa.
All right, so Uhuru Jawanza.
Uhuru.
All right, we want to welcome you first of all to the Black Power Blueprint webinar on the history of Black St. Louis. We would like for you to just give us a brief history of Moses Dixon, who is another hero of our struggle. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, definitely. Hooroo to everybody. Moses Dixon was an African-American abolitionist. He actually was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, and at the age of 16, he got on a steamboat. He was traveling through the South. For 3 years he did. He was going through Mississippi, he's going through the bayou, just kind of taking in everything that he saw. And on that excursion while on the steamboat, he ran across what we know as slavery, and it traumatized him. It had a lasting impact on him, and it truly did something to him to where whenever he came off, he wanted to do something about it. So around 1844, he made a trip to St. Louis with a couple of acquaintances he met on the trip he took down south. He formed what was known as the Knights of Tabor, or the Knights of Liberty, and they actually met and had their first meeting over on Lucas Hunt Avenue. Wow. Yeah, over on Lucas Hunt Avenue in an old brick building. And what they did was they basically made a blueprint for the organization of the Knights of Labor. So the actual blueprint of it took 2 years just to organize the actual group, the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor took 10 years to organize. So it shows you that the process and the planning of something that big and for freedom of our people is very key. That 10-year stint, they were doing tons of things. They were basically finding fearless men, noble men, men who can have a vow of secrecy because they had an oath. You can be killed, but you can't say the people that were in the organization, which is the Knights of Tabor. And what they did was through that 10 years, they were drilling the men at nighttime, training them. They were teaching them, educating them on what was going on. And throughout that 10 years, they were building the whole time, organizing their group, getting everything together. They had men and networks throughout all of the South, except the Mississippi and Texas were the only states that they didn't have men in. And they were also a part of the Underground Railroad and helping support and aid that. And throughout that whole time, they were just working with the men, working with the people, and to fulfill out the plan, which was to basically fight for their freedom. You know, an anti-slavery movement, which was known as the Knights of Tabor. And throughout this 10 years, they did a lot of different things. But the 10 years, it got stopped. After the 10 years, they didn't carry out the plan because of the Civil War. Moses Dixon actually made that call to stop the plan, because he said that a higher being was at work, talking about the Lord. He said they needed to stay strong, stay smart, and just trust in the Lord through this process, which was going to become the Civil War. The men actually didn't go through the plan. They actually joined the Union Army to help with that, and they all fought during that time. And most of them, they were all killed during that time. Moses Dixon was the only one that survived, and throughout that time, he basically, after the Civil War, he made another organization or fraternity that was called the International Order of 12, which was to commemorate the actual Knights of Tabor. And what they did, was they were basically a fraternity or organization to kind of commemorate and fulfill out or carry out what the Knights had started to do. So they had a tabernacle, they had different churches and different things like that, and they were teaching and molding and bringing up kids within the community. They had orphans, they had old people, and their whole purpose was to educate their own people and to have their children get educated and just to educate ourselves. And Moses Dixon also founded the Lincoln Institute along that time after the Civil War. He did a lot of different things, actually, and one of the things he did was found the Lincoln Institute, which is now known as Lincoln University, which is a HBCU in Jefferson City, Missouri. And yeah, so he was just doing a lot of different things. Moses Dixon was an icon. He was a true leader, and he knew exactly what to do, how to do things to get make a difference, have an impact on the community, to do everything. And yeah, so that's Moses Dixon.
That is excellent. Wow, can we give a hand to Jawanza? Yeah. Wow, that's a serious history lesson. You know, he planned 2 years. They organized for 10 years. And I also read that they organized about 47,000 people. Yes. It was estimated. Yes. So that is an army, a full army of 47,000 people. Yes. Who many or some of whom joined the Union to continue to fight for our freedom. And I also want to say, and Kitty raised this point earlier, it's so significant that it was because of these types of rebellions and this organizing that forced the Union to really address the slavery issue. You know, for example, right around that time you had what is known as Cato's Rebellion in North Carolina, I believe. And the rebellion was so tough that the white population passed a law saying that it was illegal for a white person to not carry a gun in that area. You had to have a gun. That's how serious it was. So we brought our own freedom on, and we fought and won our own freedom, and we have to be able to say that. Yeah. So thank you. Hooroo. All right. We want everybody to contribute to the freedom of African people. We need you to go and to donate. We need you to go to ucaring.com/Black Power Blueprint. Make a donation. All right. So I wanted to turn back to It's Okay. And, you know, St. Louis has a real serious history in many ways. It has a whole history of rebellion. Some of it is armed rebellion, and some of it is rebellion sought through the courts. Can you tell us a little bit about Dred Scott?
Okay. Let's start off by talking about the old courthouse, because it's very significant to the Dred Scott case. What is known now as the old courthouse is now a museum, and there's a lot of history with the old courthouse. First of all, the courthouse was built on land that Choteau, one of the French fur traders, awarded St. Louis by King France for the wealth benefited traders. And Choteau built his personal wealth on owning African people who built the infrastructure of this city and by buying up land and property. Okay, on those very steps of the old courthouse is where African people were sold as property during slavery. In fact, Africans were held in holding pens that existed on what is now the land that Bush Stadium was built on. That's important to know. And they were transported.
Did you say Bush Stadium
yes,
sits on a holding pen
Yes.
for enslaved African people?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, yes. It sits on a holding pen that enslaved African people. Okay. Bush Stadium, where they play the Cardinals play. Okay. And they were transported from the holding pen to the courthouse steps for sale. Okay. Last summer, a couple of summers ago, me and my son, this is my son, I took him to the old courthouse so that we can just kind of know the history of St. Louis. And we walked through them. We saw all of the courthouses and how it was built and the infrastructure and how it was built. What is interesting for me is when I was researching the old courthouse, they gave you more history, in Wikipedia, about the infrastructure, the architecture of the old courthouse. And they just kind of gave like one little paragraph that says that slaves were sold here. So to make a long story short, the old courthouse is the place where slave auctions were held in probate courts near the east door. The courts were ordered to sell slaves of slave owners who had died. So if your slave owner had died, then the courts were ordered to sell the slaves.
Like probate.
Like probate, exactly. Or, you know, for the slave owners who had declared bankruptcy. Their slaves were sold as well there. So getting into the Dred Scott case, make a long story short, Dred Scott was initially owned by Peter Blow's family. The family moved to St. Louis in 1830 with the Blows. The Blows began to have financial issues, and so they sold Dred Scott to a Dr. John Emerson, who was a military surgeon at the time. After purchasing Scott, Emerson took Scott to what is Illinois, then Wisconsin. It's important to know that in those territories, slavery in Wisconsin territory was prohibited by the U.S. Congress up under the Missouri Compromise. While in Wisconsin, Scott married his wife, Harriet Robinson. In 1837, the Army ordered Emerson to come to Jefferson Barracks. So Emerson, when he went to Jefferson Barracks, he pretty much left Scott and his wife Harriet at Fort Snelling in Illinois, okay, a free territory, where he leased their services out for profit. So that meant that he was bringing slavery into a free state, which was in violation of the Missouri Compromise. Okay, so Emerson went to Louisiana and married a lady named Eliza Sanford in 1838. Emerson sent for Scott and his wife Harriet to come to Louisiana. While en route, and this is important to know because it was mentioned before, their daughter Eliza, Dred Scott and Harriet had a daughter named Eliza. She was born on a steamboat pretty much between the Mississippi River and Illinois River, which was pretty much free territory, and that's going to be important in the case. And we'll come back to that. In 1843, Dr. Emerson died. And so his wife inherited Scott. And what she did was she leased them out as hired slaves. In 1846, Dred Scott attempted to purchase him and his family's freedom, but Irene Sanford refused, prompting Scott to sue for her family's freedom. Okay, so in 1846 at the old courthouse, the case went on pretty much from 1846 to 1853 at the old courthouse. To make a long story short, in a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court held that it lacked subject matter jurisdiction between Scott because he was not a citizen. In other words, they said if you are a descendant of African people, African slaves, you are not a citizen. So they ruled against him. So the decision was, number one, once you are a slave, if you come back to Missouri, you are going to be a slave, pretty much was the decision. Number two, the Supreme Court, Scott in the Supreme Court, Scott versus Sanford, federal trial. Number one, Dred Scott is not a citizen of African American descent. Dred Scott is not a citizen if he's of African American descent, okay? Number two, Scott has no standing, this is what they ruled, to bring this to trial.
you're not a citizen, so you don't have any standing to bring this to trial because you're of African descent. Number 3, the court then ruled that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. Okay, and that was the second time ever that a congressional act was overturned. And then the Supreme Court let the Missouri Supreme Court ruling stand that Dred Scott is still property. And there was a huge fallout from that decision that was made that I probably need to do a little bit more research, but pretty much that was what happened with the Dred Scott case.
Okay, thank you. And you know, one thing that stood out to me was that he was supposed to have been freed only to die less than a year later. So essentially, he was worked to death.
He was worked to death.
You know, that's the reality. He was worked to death. So thank you very much. We appreciate that. We just want to remind everybody as we get into this, you know, that we are here on behalf of the Black Power Blueprint, and we are raising money for an anti-colonial economic project that includes phase 1, the renovation of the building that we are sitting in. And you can see some of the beauty of the building just from the camera view. You can see the beautiful exposed brick walls, the curtains that we had imported. Where did the curtains come from? Because we had them.
Ghana.
They came from Ghana.
And they were sold in Philadelphia.
And so, you know, you have a real community center for the black community. This space is what is known as a Quaba Hall. So if you want to rent the space out for family events or for any kind of parties, etc., you can rent it out. It is a beautiful facility, and we've created it so that the African community can afford it. We are right here at 4101 West Florissant, right in North St. Louis, and we want everybody in this neighborhood to be able to participate in a Quaba Hall and to be able to rent it. So phase 2, which is the phase that we are on now, will include the demolition of 2 buildings across the street, which actually have been demolished, all but one small wall. So we've actually torn down these 2 buildings that could not be saved. Once we're completely finished, we're gonna pave what would be a total of 4 lots. We'll put up a fence, beautiful fence, and then we'll put up lighting so that we can have these outdoor market events where vendors come and set up and can pay a very inexpensive price to be able to have a booth so right next to the Uhuru House and the Quaba Hall where we are now. And then part of it will be a garden. And we're gonna have Mr. Brooks, who you will meet shortly. He likes us to call him Brooks, who you will meet shortly, who was critical in helping Deputy Chair Onizene Yeshitela sit in this building in 100-degree weather in the summer without any kind of plumbing for water or for the bathroom use. He was there. He let her eat there in the morning, use the bathroom, get water, put bars up on the door. So you'll meet Mr. Gary Brooks. He'll actually be conducting classes on gardening once we complete this phase, and the garden will be named in his honor as well. So we want to recognize him, and we'll bring him up shortly. So for now, I want to bring up Kitty Riley. Kitty is a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee, and she'll tell us why. We would like for you to tell us why reparations is so important to everything we've heard so far.
Uhuru, Ticharwa, I just really am honored to be here tonight and to be able, to be in the African People's Solidarity Movement due to the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, who had the science of African internationalism that would say we can have a future, and it will be through reparations to the African working class. And I also want to salute Deputy Chair Onizene Yeshitela, who, was the courageous, bold leadership that came into St. Louis for one little task and ended up seizing the moment to create something for the African community here that's going to last for generations and generations and generations. And, I just feel like I'm just really profoundly moved by everybody's presentations, because it really is about, political economy. It really is about the economic foundation that built this country and this social system and the whole white social system, and the oppression that it took and takes and the tremendous brilliance and resistance of African people from very, very early on. And it's just, you know, really buried history coming to light. And, you know, I feel like it's not only a history that for African people, but it's history for white people, without which we only have a white nationalist history that would say we have a place in the world based on something other than what it was, which was oppression, you know, and genocide. And, you know, we're very much a part of the story of African people under the brutal conditions of slavery and colonialism, because that is our history too, but we lived on the other side of the story. We benefited from it, and we fought to maintain the system of slavery that everyone has been talking about. So we know we have to really deepen our understanding of reparations and the basis for reparations, because everything in this country and that you see in the white world is based on the legacy of slavery and colonialism. And, you know, it's really incredible how African people have utilized every means that they could to be free.
That's right.
Even, you know, from legal means to, you know, armed resistance, organizing, you know, the whole Underground Railroad, what courage that took. And to think that Mrs. Meacham was, during Slattery, she was doing the Underground Railroad in Missouri. It's really, you know, it's really profound history that we're learning about. And, you know, we also learned about, you know, the Mississippi River. So, okay, being new here the past year, I look at the Mississippi and it's like, it looks like it's less than a mile wide from here to Illinois, you know. And, but we hear about, like, it was really sort of free territory. So Dred Scott utilized it in the hearing, trying to win his child's freedom. That's right. Because she was born on the Mississippi River, which was supposed to be free area. You know, the Meachams had a school. They, you know, such self-determination, put a boat in the middle of the Mississippi and said, this is free territory and we're gonna have a school. And, you know, it's just really unbelievable. But, you know, also one of the most horrific massacres of African people occurred right across that little mile river. In East St. Louis. And a lot of times we hear about, you know, the horrific massacres that, you know, were done by white people, by white settlers, and, you know, white land grabbers and white cavalry people, you know, just steal the indigenous people's land and resources, you know, such as the Sand Creek Massacre in November of 1864. That was 675 members of the Colorado U.S. volunteer cavalry. They weren't even paid. This is our history as white people. We were the state. They didn't even have to have, quote, the police. We were volunteer, you know, cavalry. And they attacked a village of mostly Arapaho and Cheyenne women and children and killed and mutilated up to 500 indigenous people. And it's only recently that you can read what was always called race riots, and still is, interchangeably called massacres. And that is exactly what happened to black communities. And there was a slate of them from 1917 to 1921, including in East St. Louis, which, you know, resulted in, oh, they use numbers like 300 to 500 or whatever. You know, it's the top number. 500 African people were brutally murdered, lynched, and, you know, being shot by regular white people started the attack, and it, you know, and continued it for like 3 days and nights or whatever. You know, it was several days, as all of them were. And there was even witnesses, not only to the lynchings, but also mutilations where these white people, you know, shot an African woman's arm right off her body. I mean, that to me is like profound. And just in our summing up of the webinar, I learned that Asoke's family is from East St. Louis, and she was born and raised in East St. Louis, and is a teacher in East St. Louis. And I wanted to ask you a little, if you could tell us a little bit about your family's experience and the history passed down to you about the 1917 East St. Louis massacre.
Well, it's a very, honestly, it's a very dark time. that my grandmother just makes little comments about. She doesn't talk a lot about it, I think because it was such a traumatic experience for her. But what I do know is, I guess people don't realize, when people think about East St. Louis, they think it's just one big city, but East St. Louis is kind of divided. Okay. And I do remember and recall stories of my grandmother saying, well, we call now the South End of East St. Louis. It's called the South End. That's where the black people lived. And the other parts of East St. Louis is where the white people lived. And so the race riots had something to do with black people coming from the South and I guess trying to move in to that area. Me and my son went to, last year, we just went to at SIUE campus, East St. Louis. We just went to a celebration that commemorated the 100-year anniversary of the East St. Louis race riots. And there are several books out there and several organizations that put together that event. And a lot of even children in East St. Louis don't really know about the race riots. And I think one of the things that we have to do is continue to tell the story, because our ancestors, my grandmother, she just talks about it very vaguely. She remembers it, but she doesn't go into detail about it. I think because it was very traumatic for her. You know, she actually lived through it. She actually experienced it, but it was a very dark time for her. And so just being from East St. Louis, to know that I come from a place, you know, where our people resisted the way that they resisted, in the way that they resisted. They fought to the end, they fought to their death. It gives me a lot of pride in knowing, and to this day, East St. Louis is, I know people talk about East St. Louis, but it's one of the blackest cities. It's one of the blackest cities in the country. You know, anytime you have a national holiday dedicated to Malcolm X's birthday, we get out of school for Malcolm X's birthday. You know, it's one of the blackest places. By black, for black, ran by black people. So,
yeah, I wanted to intervene and just say that, you know, I know that Kitty mentioned the term massacres. You know, because one of the things that the white ruling class will do was they will phrase things in a way that liquidates the actual event, you know, and they will allow the oppressor, I'm looking for a different word, but the guilty party to
I feel so guilty.
Yeah, by phrasing things in a funny way. So
Semantics.
you know, we don't even call it a race riot, you know, because that implies that both sides had an equal part in it, when in fact it was just a massacre, you know, and it was one of many. And you know, it was a dark moment in our history, but America has been a dark moment in our history, you know. So I just wanted that.
I so appreciate that. I mean, in the white community, it's so romanticized about how, you know, our people came from Europe and so oppressed and, you know, on that boat on the bottom tier and pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps. And when you think about African people and how African people got to all the various places, I mean, that was a history of brutality, you know. And as white people, we came and we made it up the ladder on the backs of African people. There was not any, there was oppression in Europe when we got here. We quickly, you know, oppressed Africans, killed indigenous people, got farm land. I mean, that's the real difference in the history. And I know, you know, we are raising money tonight for the Black Power Blueprint, and this really is resistance in action right now, right here in St. Louis. This is powerful, powerful history that we're hearing. This is an incredible project that the African working class community has led, is leading right now. It is pushing back, you know, gentrification and attacks on the African community by building, 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 building. And you've seen the victories. And in fact, I just got passed a note that said that we have a donation of $30 from Alyssa Afanina.
All right.
That's really incredible. She is has donated so much to the Black Power Blueprint. She has donated during the week, during webinars, incredible. A $40 donation from Casey Mackey, our very own production director. A $25 donation from Robert Wood. I don't know where Robert Wood is from. I really, really appreciate you, Robert, for making that donation. And a $50 donation from Penny Hess. She chairs the African People Solidarity Committee. That is incredible. That means $195 was raised, and we have $805 to go. Wow. 4 minutes ago, Janice Cant donated $50 and said, thank you for this fantastic history lesson from the point of view of the African working class. Such tremendous wealth accumulated by white people through violence and terrorism. Reparations now.
All right.
Whoops.
You got more?
I don't know how to get it right. I want to read what Penny Hess said.
Yeah, and while we do that, I also want to recognize a person who we have not met, who we've seen give multiple times and reach out to us, Larry Smith. So we wanted to recognize him. And we will be in contact with you and just thank you for your continuous contributions.
Great. Robert Wood said, Uhuru, St. Louis. Penny Hess said, Uhuru to the history of African people in St. Louis. So powerful, reparations to African people. Right. Thank you so, so much. And Larry Smith made 2 donations recently in the past week. So that is really, really powerful.
And Robert Wood, I think he's made multiple donations too. So we want to recognize all of our donors and say thank you. It is regular $5, $10, $15, $25, $50 donations that have made this project possible.
So that's $755 more to go.
All right, let's make it happen.
Keep it coming. Friends watching, keep it coming, because right now we have an incredible process with the buildings coming down, the bricks still being stacked and removed, and then there's building a program, and that's the most important thing, because it takes empty lots and puts them into the ability to have a program for the African community right here in St. Louis. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Uhuru. Go to youcaring.com/Black Power Blueprint.
Okay. All right. That leads us to talking about the Great Migration. Ticharwa, can you tell us about the waves of migration following World War I and II that brought so many black people from the south to the north? I mean, how did we get to Missouri?
Yeah. So, you know, African people, it's important to say that, you know, we were here early on. There were 500 African people brought here in this area to a little town south of St. Louis called St. Genevieve. And we were enslaved and brought here to work lead mines, even before Lewis and Clark, who were slave owners also, got here. But African people entered St. Louis just like we did other northern cities in these waves of so-called migrations. So they call these the Great Migrations. And it's important for us to understand that because the white population, the white ruling class, the white working class, they had to react to these waves of African people coming here. So we have to understand that dynamic in order to understand St. Louis. So during the First Imperialist War, we call it the First and Second Imperialist War, you had waves of African people coming to the north looking for work, primarily as a result of war industries that grew up around these 2 wars. Now these 2 wars were first and foremost, it should be noted that they were wars of aggression by various European powers to divide up Africa and other colonized countries and lands, I should say. So that's what the motive force for these 2 wars were. So in the Second Imperialist War, you have the U.S. emerge as the primary economic power and able to have access to all of these raw materials that they can now get from the continent of Africa. So they're the primary colonizer at this point. So they have access to these raw materials, and they need to be able to transform these raw materials into finished products. So they need labor in order to make that happen. So you have these northern industrialists that now have an incentive to break up the existing economic relations that exist primarily in the South, where African people are placed on, are still on plantations as sharecroppers and indentured servants, and sharecroppers in the South. So they want to break this up, and they need to get more black people to the north. So they support one sector of the African community. They support this one sector of the African community, which is the liberal sector of the black community, known as the civil rights, or represented by the civil rights establishment. So they support this new civil rights movement in order to get this labor into the north. And just for as an example, even in 1923, the Department of Commerce states that there were 500,000 African people who went from the south to the north. And in 1950, 150,000 African people were in St. Louis, as many as there are today. You know, at a time when the population was near 1 million, though. So we were a smaller portion. So you have these waves of African people coming to the north to be able to transform these raw materials into finished products in these factories and war industries. So in the process, we also, and we'll bring Mr. Brooks in a second, he wants to speak. So in the process, you have also this need, in addition to this need for black labor, now you have black people with jobs, so you have a sector of the white liberal community that wants to take advantage of this new black consumer dollar. And then there's a crisis going on at the same time with housing, because in first imperialist war, you have the so-called Great Depression, and the second imperialist war, you have all of the materials of the country being employed for this war effort, so no housing is being built. So you have these African people in these large numbers in these northern cities, and then you have this housing crisis. So that might be a good place to stop, but that is the background that kind of sets the stage for much of the conflict that you see African people have in St. Louis.
Did you want to ask Mr. True?
Yes, and we want to turn to Brooks, and he wanted to intervene.
Good evening, everybody.
First
thing off, I'm going to, I'm looking at next week. I'm going to barbecue, raise a little money for y'all. And all you got to do is just show up and eat. And it's going to be something small, just chicken and hot dogs and stuff, and cold soda and stuff. And the thing is that I would like for this organization to do, the neighborhood does not understand what you're doing. They have not, you need something, some kind of way, need to reach out to them to get them to come here for a meeting, block at a time or whatever it is. There are a lot of people who are curious, but they also are afraid because things have come into this neighborhood and has went back out as soon as it got here. So we need to get in touch with the people. And the second thing of it is the older generation are not going anywhere. They paying their taxes and they live in here, but the people that are renting and running up and down the streets do not care. And if you try and show them, they figure out a better way of flipping drugs or flipping this or that to make fast money. Nobody wants to take time out to earn it where they can go home and lay down and breathe good, that they have made a living for themselves and their families. You can't say anything to the kids nowadays because the parents want to jump up in your face. The kids is bad, the parents is bad. I mean, you know, grandmas are 20 years old and 25 years old and all this kind of stuff. We need to work on getting some of this stuff back under control. There is no feelings anymore in families because it takes a whole neighborhood to raise kids. You can't raise them by yourself. The old folks used to tell you that all the time. Everybody in the block know who everybody is and everybody looking out for everybody. But it's a shame to get up every morning and I got to look at the news and somebody is shot and dead. Young people over here, it's been, you know, just senseless. Thing about, I watched this neighborhood, when I moved over the neighborhood, it wasn't all that great, but I had chose it because I was able to get the building at a reasonable price and was able to stay here and it. I put me a little garden next door to the side and I want to expand it when that building gets all tore down. I want to make it a little bit bigger and I want to show the kids how to grow stuff. You know, it's important to know how to survive in this day and age, to keep running to the store and buying a head of cabbage when you can grow it yourself in the backyard. You know, and you can grow some tomatoes, you know, more vegetables and stuff. You live and stay off the diet, you know, so you don't come down with sugar and diabetes and all that kind of stuff. You know, make yourself a little more healthier. you know, because the White Castle, Jack in the Box, and fried chicken ain't gonna get it. You know, you need to put some vegetables in your system, period. You know, you need to do some things like that. And the building across the street where the liquor store is, that was a 905 store at one time. And then a gentleman from California moved here and bought it and started running it, but he had some sons and daughters, and him and his wife was running it, but the kids got hooked off on the drugs, and boom, it's all over. He went and killed himself because he just got tired of the things that he had to go to, and his wife was suffering. The man, go one block down, there was another man that come in from Mississippi and raised his family, sent his kids to school. They would work for the school board, the post office, went to college. He couldn't sign his own name. The people that worked in the tavern had to sign the checks when the man would deliver the liquor and the beer and stuff. You know, Miss Jackson on the corner right there, she's been there a long time serving food here in the neighborhood. But what I want to see people do is that we need to band together and make our neighborhood stronger, because now you walk out the door, you got a church on every corner and a Chinese on every corner. You got the Indian, the Pakistanis on the other corner selling the groceries and stuff. When their prices are high and there, you don't want to go over there to the Save a Lot shop and save in them places where you can save, get your money to go a little bit further. You know, you want to get up and eat them Philly cheese sandwiches and them fried chickens and stuff they're selling in there in the early morning breakfast. Nobody wants to go the extra mile to make things better, you know, and that's what I would like to see before I die. I want to see some progress within this community, within the neighborhood, and we need to go on. We need to stop fighting each other. You know, half the people don't want to speak. And all of us in here know when you go in one of these fast food places, they don't count the change back to you anymore. They just put it in your hand. Receipt, put the money right in your hand. They never say thank you. You be standing in the line, there'd be 10 of you standing in line. Nobody turns around and says, well, be right with you, sir. We backed up. We're trying to help get them on out of here. Nobody turns around. They just keep on walking, don't say anything to you. And all of them has got attitude. They come to work with an attitude. You know, I didn't make you, so ain't no need of you being mad at me. You know, me come there, put a smile on your face. People will come in when you treat them right. You know, but
well, we're gonna fight for this community. And we're gonna fight for this community so we can change some of that.
We do. I hope the fighting you're gonna do.
And we ain't going nowhere.
And I'm gonna let her know when I'm going to do the barbecue and stuff of that nature, and sodas and stuff, and make a donation to whatever y'all trying to raise.
Okay, we thank you. All right.
Thank you so much, Mr. Brooks. I just want to announce, people are really moved, you know, by this webinar. Johan Bedingfield donated $10. That's incredible. Thank you. Allison Haney donated $30. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Ali Aiello donated $25.
All right.
Great. Rosie and Eli Tance donated $50. Fantastic. Steve Smith donated $10.
All right,
And Ruby Gildeson donated $25. So fantastic. So we only have $605 more to go, and I want to donate $25 to the Black Power Blueprint. I wish it was more, but yes, absolutely. This is reparations. I can't begin to hear these stories and get this kind of understanding, you know, and not take reparations, because it's really the deepest kind of thing we can do. It's not just like a payback, which it is, it's actually beginning to develop a principled relationship to the Black community through reparations, and it shows that we actually really do support African self-determination. And that so much, oh my goodness.
Looks like.
Whoa, wow. Chairman Omali Shatella and Ona Zanea Shatella just donated $155. All right, fantastic.
Thank you.
These are the leadership, the visionaries, the workers.
Yes.
These are the ones who taught us how to work, actually.
Thank you.
I can certainly say that as a North American in the Solidarity Movement. I have never, ever, ever seen work like I have seen from the African working class. I don't care. White people do not know the meaning of the word work because we're in a parasitic relationship to this whole economy and the whole birth of this social system. It makes us parasites. We're fluff. We're sitting on a pedestal. You know, the work, the labor, you know, Africans have carried us all these years on their backs. It's time for us to get off that pedestal, get on the ground and start putting every skill, every cent, every resource, all the social wealth. When we hear these stories, it shows us that it's been generations and generations of African exploitation. That is generations of wealth in our pockets, and we have to turn it over. We've got a positive future under the Black Power blueprint.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
I want to read comments. How do you make yours go? This way?
Yeah, let me speak for a minute.
Let me read first because we have it close. Yeah. Let me read the comments. Wow, this is from Omali and Onizane Shatella.
I don't know if you all want.
Uhuru to Comrade Ticharwa, Brandy, Asoke, and Son Zion. A salute to you, revolutionary soldiers for Africa and African people. Your dedication is remarkable and highly appreciated. Salute to Mr. Gary Brooks, Black Power Community Garden. All right, fantastic message, Uhuru. Uhuru, thank you.
Okay, so we want to pick up with this, okay?
Okay.
Yeah.
So, can you explain more about what you meant when you say the civil rights movement that was an alliance between the liberal sector of white ruling class and the liberal sector of the black middle class? Can you elaborate more on that, Ticharwa?
Yeah. So, you know, as I stated, you have this new incentive for a certain sector of the white ruling class to change the relations of production that exists in the South, meaning that you have African people who have been forced to work, you know, on plantations even after slavery. In fact, in 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had his Attorney General issue a memo to all of the attorneys general in the United States, stating that they should start to prosecute cases of peonage, slavery, and involuntary servitude. This is 1941. So that shows you how African people were still locked in the South on these plantations in one form or another. And then you had this prison system develop in this country as a way to bring African people who got off one plantation onto another plantation. So we know the 13th Amendment said that slavery, you know, is to be abolished except for punishment for a crime. So you had this new form of slavery as African, as this white, the plantation owners, they still needed black labor. So you had this sector in the North that needed the labor out of the South, so they wanted it out of the South. So they lifted up one sector of the black middle class, the liberal sector of the black middle class. They supported the civil rights movement. They funded all of these civil rights organizations, and then they struggled for you know, this movement that would allow African people to come out of the South. So then they get to the North, and then it was some of these same liberals who, I'm being told I need to move over. It was some of these same white liberals who then wanted to segregate black people in the North. So that was what was happening in St. Louis. You had the conservatives, the Republicans didn't want to support any kind of public housing initiative. They thought it was socialism. But then you had the white liberals who wanted black people in the labor, but they wanted us segregated. So they created this whole process of ensuring that African people would not have the ability to live in the same neighborhoods that white people lived in. It was not because they didn't like us or because of racism. It was because they wanted two separate economies. And they wanted white people, to live at the expense of African people. That was the relationship, this colonial relationship going back to the, you know, the very first settlers. So they start this process. One of those things includes zoning. So then they start using these zoning mechanisms where they would, first initially, they would just try to write ordinances that say that black people were not allowed to live in certain areas. So you actually see one of the zoning ordinances right here. This was from 1926 in St. Louis. So they create this planning commission that does the zoning, and then they start, just making laws. So eventually, that didn't, that couldn't last because the Supreme Court overruled that, not because they cared about black people, but because it was an infringement on the property rights of white people. So they had to start finding other ways to zone. Then they started creating neighborhoods where they would have single-family neighborhoods that they would steer white people into. Then in the black neighborhoods, they would zone those as multi-family and commercial and industrial. And they would allow those liquor stores that Mr. Brooks just identified, those taverns, those nightclubs, those liquor stores. In fact, this used to be a tavern. And so that is a result of these zoning techniques that intended to push all of the vice, what do they call it? The vice.
That's true.
Yeah,
but you couldn't. But you stop them in there and you stop to think. Now, Crab Packing Company has been around for a long time. Crab Packing Meat Company. People worked at buses, fuels. They could come to work, get off the bus, go in the factory and work, and get back on the bus. They could get back on the bus and go back home. They could not walk up the street. This here had stores, Western Auto, bakery, Western Auto, bakeries, and they had a movie theater across there. Was a boxing gym where Spinks and them trained at. They had 905 across the street. There was a whole sorts of things in this neighborhood. But you couldn't crawl, you couldn't leave Crab Packing Company and come this way, or you got jumped on. You couldn't go over in the park. We had a big trouble ride over there in the park over where the swimming pool is, because we couldn't swim in the pool. We had a ride over there, And I think that if you got people coming into St. Louis, groups of people coming into St. Louis to do some visiting, what would be nice if you could take the young people and let them sit down and put a program together. See, there are places here in the city where blacks made rod-on railing, went all over the world. Made railroad cars and tracks and all of this stuff. They made this with hot rolled steel, with no welding, down there on the Sale Street. And the captains, all the guys that own these big, long luxury liners, steamboats and stuff, they built their home down there on LaSalle and all them streets down there. And it would be nice that if they could put it together where people come into town, they would have something to go see. Take them and show them where this took place at. And then there's a black museum here in St. Louis. I don't know if y'all been to it or not. Have you been down there to it?
It used to be on St. Louis Avenue. Is that the one on St. Louis Avenue?
It's on St. Louis Avenue. Yeah. And he has all the stuff going back into 1930, 1920, 1990, all back in there. He has all that stuff in there. One of the best hospitals in the world was right over at Homer G. Phillips Hospital. The military brought their doctors in here to learn how to sew people up from being shot and cut. They trained them. Had a hell of a nursing school and stuff. But these are the things that need to be brought out, so when people come to town, they can be able to go and see what this is doing. Because when Martin Luther King got killed, Mayor Cervantes kept the city from blowing up. He put all the black leaders together and come up with some kind of a plan. That it didn't ride like it did in Chicago and Los Angeles, California, all them places. They didn't do that, Philadelphia. He kept it under control because he got the leaders together. But it was a very insulting thing for my mother to get on the train and ride all the way from Pacific to St. Louis to go to a ball game. You had to stand outside and peek through a hole in the wall, right up here on Grand Avenue. You know what I mean? Those are insulting things. It was Ladies' Day. They had to stand outside and look at the ball game. At least they listened to it on the radio. There's a lot of things that went on in this town that is very deep rooted to me, because I couldn't go in Woolworths and get me a hamburger and sit down. I had to stand up and eat it. I go downtown to Sticksbury and Fuller and all them places down there. They had a basement down there where you wouldn't shop at. You didn't shop up what the other folks did upstairs. And the city of St. Louis has a lot of racial history, and it's very deeply rooted. And when you mistreat my mama or mistreat my father, you ain't got nothing coming from me.
That's right.
And I ain't got nothing coming.
All right.
That's all I got to say.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brooks.
To the house.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Brooks.
Mr.
Thank you. We
Brooks.
appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, yes.
Those are the elders. Ms. Mack.
Thank you.
Okay. Oh, you move on?
Yeah, I know about slavery because my mother's grandmother was a slave. And
Okay. Wait.
will tell us all of how it went down. And they had there's a town called Herman, Missouri, where they used to take the slaves and hide them, move them up north. They used to hide them in there. And they would smother with when people would be looking for them. And the women that had the babies,
Okay.
a lot of them
Let's
didn't make
ask
because they would smother the babies
so
to
that's
keep
what
from
it is.
getting everybody else caught and locked up.
Yeah.
They would, they smother the baby there.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Brooks.
Thank you so much.
All right. So,
I
Ticharwa,
appreciate it.
while the white liberals were fighting to get blacks up to the northern factories, that meant they had to have housing neighborhoods in order to actually live there and work in those factories. So that must have been a real problem for white people who did not want to see African people moving in next door. She wants to.
Yeah, so yeah, you have these African people coming north, and it's not just St. Louis. I mean, this was a whole phenomenon, and it's really part of a colonial system that exists off the exploitation of African people. So they want to create these two separate economic relationships where one people can continue to live at the expense of the other. So they create these zoning plans in order to do so. But that's not effective enough, because even if you have cities zoned where you try one is zoned for residential single family homes and the other is zoned for multi-family homes, well, some black people could still afford those single family homes in St. Louis. So they had to find a way to really secure a way to keep African people out of white neighborhoods. So then they start to use the government for that purpose. So they use the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, and then they begin to subsidize. They create this mechanism where they subsidize loans to white developers. So for example, the city of St. Anne, that whole city initially was built by a white developer by the name of Charles Vatterott. We heard of Vatterott College, who was given subsidies by the FHA in order to build this city, under the stipulation that he not build any houses for black people.
Wow.
So you create this, they create this whole mechanism, and this happened not just in St. Louis, but the FHA is a subsidy program where they insure mortgages and insure loans. So any so-called developer that wants to build 15,000 homes, they'll get a subsidy from the government to allow them to get a loan and do so. And they had to do so under the stipulation that African people would not be able to live in these certain neighborhoods. So that they wanted to pile us in the ghettos. They wanted to pile us in places where they had industrial waste being polluted, and where they had liquor stores and everybody could just dump whatever kind of vice of business that they had right into the African community. So yeah, so I know we're kind of getting off into this, but I just want to bring it home because as we look at the history of St. Louis, we get this tendency for African people to blame ourselves. We don't understand this whole process, and that's what we really want to try to unveil, is to reveal this whole process and help people understand that every condition that African people face in the ghetto is because we are colonized people. There's one system that allows one people to live at the expense of the other. So we've developed a way to fight back against that, and we call it the Black Power Blueprint. Okay, and this is a project being funded by African people and by white people who want to stand on the right side of history. So, we're not beholden to the government. We're not beholden to any of these agencies which have been set up to help facilitate this process. We work for black people and black power. That's what you're supporting. So we want you to go to ukraine.com/Black Power Blueprint.
And you know what, Ticharwa? Some people have gone.
All right.
Yep. We have a $50 donation from Maureen Wagner.
All right. Uhuru.
Wonderful donation, Uhuru. And a $15 donation from Bakri Alatunji.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much. Uhuru. We have a message from Maureen. White people owe reparations for 600 years of stolen black labor. Salute to the Black Power Blueprint, building self-reliance and economic development in the African community. Uhuru, thank you so much. And Steve Smith, I'm here to promote Black Power. I am a Roma, Indigenous, LGBT, and other things. I am with solidarity and glad to take part in the fight.
All right.
Really appreciate that. Uhuru. And Rosie and Eli Tance, who donated earlier, said, so Black Power Blueprint can do more. Uhuru. Fantastic. And Ali Aliola, who donated earlier, said, Uhuru, thank you for teaching the things that my history classes were too ignorant to, so explicitly teach. Uhuru through reparations.
Yes.
And Allison Haney said, what a powerful history. Thank you for educating us about our brutal history as white people and how we can start to rectify it by paying reparations to the Black Power Blueprint for African self-determination. Thank you so much to all the supporters of the Black Power Blueprint who have donated. We've actually raised a total of $590. That's only $410 left. I know that we can do this. People can get on, do the $10, do 100, do the 400, do 50. Get on ucaring.com /Black Power Blueprint, because when we hear this powerful summation from Ticharwa, we can understand there were really no good guys. There were no good guys. There wasn't one sector of the white rulers in this country were for Black people and the other sector weren't. They all had, they were two sides of the same coin, and they all had their own material interests, their economic interests. And however they could utilize the Black working class community, a population kept in a colonial state with no political power, they did that to further their own interests as top capitalists. And, you know, and then, I mean, it's profound what you are bringing out, you know, about, it makes me just think about, like, even the history of St. Louis, everything is a high-level plan and strategy, and they have all facets of society, the status quo, playing a role in carrying that out. And, you know, they talk about the New Deal and the Fair Deal, but what deal? You know, what, it was a deal for white people across the board any way you look at it. And it really makes me, you know, want to say to, you know, people in the white community that, you know, are viewing this webinar, the whole anti-racism, you know, solution that's put forward by some people, where is that? I mean, what is that about? This wasn't about ideas, you know, in our heads that would change material conditions. These were real material conditions that were going on. You have to donate now because, I mean, Amalia Chatella already exposed that as a dead-end street in his book, Uneasy Equilibrium. That was really a dead-end street. Yes, there was profound racial hatred, but that was upon a material basis. That wasn't just some idea in white people's heads that floated there out of nowhere. It was rooted in a material basis, and that was controlling the land, the labor, the economy of African and indigenous people for our benefit, that would spawn and perpetuate such ideas. Okay, it might have been part of why we went to the suburbs, but Ticharwa was just also revealing that there were really two neighborhoods and two economies. And that was the root. That is the root. And it's really profound to really understand that, because when we understand that and unite and embrace that, we know that we can also unite with the aspirations of the African working class community for freedom and independence and community control. Like Mr. Gary said, we need community control of our communities. And, you know, that is what we're supporting when we give reparations to the Black Power Blueprint and to this incredible thing that's happening right here in St. Louis. So get on to ucaring.com /Black Power Blueprint. Let's get that $410 to go. Uhuru.
Yeah. Uhuru. All right, I'm going to turn back to you, Ticharwa. Ticharwa, can you talk about the government strategy and other reasons for white people moving, we call it white flight, moving to the suburbs? Can you expound on that?
Yeah. So you see this whole process of the white ruling class having to find more definitive ways to create these and maintain these two economies. So they tried zoning at first. They had to improve on zoning. And then they went to, the FHA developed, Federal Housing Administration, to subsidize white developers and the white working class to buy homes, and then be able to create these two economies on that basis. And then you had restrictive covenants, which was also part of that process, where white people would first just try to get other white people to agree to put in the deeds that they would never sell to a black person as a condition for selling the home. And then it didn't work well enough with individuals, because some individuals may not have done it. And so if you didn't do it and I was your white neighbor, then I tried to, I wouldn't have a grounds to sue if you didn't put it in your covenant. So then they started to create neighborhood associations and have their whole neighborhood associations agree to do it. So this is really the creation of the neighborhood association. And then the FHA, the federal government through the FHA, would then require, again, these home builders to create homeowners associations of white people, white neighborhoods, and then put it into the homeowners associations. So you had that whole government process. All in 1950, it is said that over 50% of all the mortgages in the United States of America were subsidized or given out by the VA and subsidized by the Veterans Administration and the Federal Housing Administration. So this was a thing that existed all over the country, and it helped maintain this whole system of two economies, with one economy living at the expense of the other. So I wanted to try to tie that in too, because this led to the conditions that we see. And what happened is you create the conditions for the ghetto, or what they call slums, to emerge. And then after they created the conditions for the slums to emerge, then they start developing theories about what to do with ghettos and what to do with slums. So then you have these plans, these what they call urban renewal plans, which St. Louis is famous for. There was one in 1948 by the same zoning commission. And that plan was to triage the black community, to triage the St. Louis. So divide St. Louis into three categories: communities that were determined to be wealthy and on the move, communities that were right next to blighted communities and that you had to save from being negatively impacted by these blighted communities, and then you had the African communities, which were determined to be, like a mortally wounded person on the battlefield. You can't help them. So they then initiated this policy to allow African communities to go into decay. So you had a plan in 1948, and then you had a plan later in 1974, which was officially beat off the books by the African community, but most people still believe that this plan was underway, called the Team 4 plan, to just allow North St. Louis to dilapidate, to fall into ruin over time. And then they created these things called land banks, which the Land Reutilization Authority is a land bank. So once these, you allow decay to occur, the land bank can then accumulate land over time, hold that land, and then when something like the NGA comes along, they can then sell 99 acres of urban land to one developer, or to a small few developers who can buy large scale land, and then this paves the way for gentrification. Lastly, I want to say, because I know I'm getting a little winded, but coming out of the 60s, you had the Black Power movement. And so, white people also determined that it was unsafe to have large, concentrated numbers of potentially revolutionary black people in these urban areas. So they then wanted to disperse us as well. So that was part of the plan. In this process, what people call spatial deconcentration, they started to create these government agencies. They created community development corporations, which is the main vehicle that the white ruling class uses today to gentrify neighborhoods through these community development corporations and the tax breaks they get, because they wanted to bring capitalism back into these urban areas to prevent black power and socialism from occurring. So now you have these vehicles that are being used today: homeowners associations, zoning, community development corporations, HUD, FHA. These are all the mechanisms being used today to destroy the black community. So the Black Power Blueprint is something that is fighting against that. This is not just an attempt by black people to integrate into this system and imitate what we see the ruling class do. This is designed to be a direct contest to the white ruling class. So you have to support this.
Yes.
We are only in phase 2 of phase 3. You see the building behind you. You see that your contributions go directly to material results. So we need you to donate. We need you to go to youcaring.com/Black Power
Blueprint.
/Black Power Blueprint. I'm sorry, and make a donation.
And you know what, Ticharwa, we got some more donations.
More donations.
Because I was just going to say how you were pointing out that how the U.S. government picks sectors to be able to, pour in an economy, and one was the veterans, 50% of all the housing loans. And, veterans owe reparations too, as a sector of the white community, for sure. And here we have a real powerful veteran who has supported the Black Power Blueprint right from the start, Mr. Bobby Wittenberg.
That's right.
And he just donated another $100. Uhuru, Bobby, really want to express appreciation for your stand for reparations and your unity with the black community, having power, because power, when I hear, Ticharwa's presentation, it's so clear that only political power in the hands of the African working class is going to solve the problems. And Carol Locke agrees. She just donated $20 to the Black Power Blueprint.
Thank you.
Very much. This leaves us with only 290 more to go. And we can do it because, it's just so incredible what the Black Power Blueprint, Black Star Industries, the African People's Education and Defense Fund are exposing to all of us from wherever we live around the country about the political economy. Because I saw a movie or TV show or something recently, and it was about the Team 4 plan and the men who actually wrote it and orchestrated it. They are alive. They live in St. Louis. This is not far-fetched. They are my age. In the 1970s, and they're just talking about it, in the 1970s, if you looked at, mine and Casey's community here, if you look at this Forest Park, the Central West End, Tower Grove, they looked like North St. Louis. Vacant, abandoned houses. Forest Park was dirt. It was dirt. But the people who ran the hospitals, Barnes Hospital, wanted to really stop the flight of hospitals to the suburbs. So they pulled all the hospitals that were left here to build Barnes Jewish Hospital, it's a huge, huge hospital here in the city of St. Louis. And the medical school is a huge economy in the city of St. Louis. And they literally put it at the Central West End, which was completely dilapidated. And they built Forest Park. And to placate the African community, or North St. Louis, they built O'Fallon Park, a smaller park to placate. And they built Carondelet Park to placate the far south of St. Louis.
Wow.
But when you look at O'Fallon Park, which is a lovely park here, but it's nothing like Forest Park that has millions of dollars in an ice skating rink and a museum in it, and an arboretum and flowers and trees. It's just an incredible park. It's the second largest park next to Central Park, which is in New York City. It is Forest Park here in St. Louis. And they built it up. They all started promoting basically gentrification. And they bought old houses and restored them to show people you can live here, to build houses for what would be coming the medical students to come here. And they really did exactly what you're saying. And this is in a very short period, in like 30 or 40 years. They just took all the money from the African community and they put it in certain sections of the white community that they felt were redeemable, and they built it. And then now that they're ready to gentrify with the NGA, which they all knew was coming, I'm sure, they now want that land bank that they've held on to, of that, what called the LRA properties, and they want the vacant houses they've been holding on to free them up to developers because they know that they're going to be getting engineers in here and white people coming in here, and they're going to have housing. So it's a brilliant strategy. I will salute Black Star Industries, the African People's Education and Defense Fund. I will salute Owners and Shatella for navigating the process of getting LRA properties.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Absolutely. So come on, folks, get on to youcaring.com/Black Power Blueprint, and let's wrap it up. And we got beautiful statements from Bobby Wittenberg of Uhuru. The Black Power Blueprint is self-determination and economic development. You can see, as white people, all we have is stolen from African and other colonized people. It's time to turn over those stolen resources to Black Power. Blueprint is the solution, is the future. Thank you so much. Salute Bobby Wittenberg, tremendous backbone of our fund drive. Carol Locke, Uhuru, white people benefit from the heinous crimes against humanity towards African and indigenous people. Reparations are the most principled way white people can stand in solidarity with African people. Salute to you too, Carol Locke. Profound statements and a really profound stance.
Ricky Clay.
Oh, this is Bakri Alatunji. Ain't no power like the power of Black Power. Ain't no blueprint as powerful as Black Power Blueprint.
He's feeling it.
All right. Top Bakri Alatunji. Uhuru. Thank you. 290 more to go.
I wanted to just add, what we saw in Ferguson with the murder of Mike Brown was a direct consequence of everything we talked about today. The African community in Ferguson, like all African communities, is a community that was continuously displaced, and they were pushed into Ferguson. It was never intended for African people even to be in Ferguson. It was created as a place for white people to go, like the suburbs in general, for a place for white people to escape, while all of the pollution and crime and criminal businesses were intended to exist in the African community. But it was this continuous pushing of African people out of African communities and the creating of ghettos and slums in African communities that forced African people north into Ferguson. And in fact, the first supposedly all-black city in America was Kinloch, right next to Ferguson, and that community was destroyed partially as a result of the airport that they wanted to put there, and then those people had to go into Ferguson. So it was these conditions of these constantly displaced people with no economic opportunity for life, that created the conditions. And then you have the police, whose purpose in this process is to ensure that this population that is exploited is never able to challenge the white ruling class that lives at their expense. And that's why we had Darren Wilson in there patrolling this African boy, following him around, because that is the role of the police. And in fact, even in St. Louis right now, the largest expense for the city is the police. In America in general, the largest expense is the military. So you have all of these mechanisms that feed into a constant oppression of African people. And you have this whole sector of black people who are then, this small sector of black people who have these middle class aspirations, who are then lifted up to serve as a buffer between the oppressed sector, African working class, and the white ruling class in collaboration with the white working class. So yeah, this is the dynamic that you have. And the Black Power Blueprint is not just an attempt by some people to acquire the ability to do development so that they can get rich and imitate the white ruling class. We are an African working class organization. We are on the ground, and we are giving African people right here in North St. Louis the ability to feed, clothe, and house ourselves, and the capacity to wage political struggle for our own self-determination and ultimately for Black Power. So you have to support this project. You should go to youcaring.com/Black Power Blueprint to donate.
Uhuru. Uhuru. I really appreciate, your summation, and the price the African community has paid for what is called white development, gentrification, suburban life, peaceful communities, food, choices of meals, different foods for every meal. There's a real price that African people have paid. And, I think about Darren Wilson and the role white people have played historically as the police, before that, overseers on the plantations, the slave catchers, the police, the judges, And I know, every white family, we have relatives. We have relatives. I could just, the last gathering that I went to, well, let's just say, my nephew is a cop. He's a detective outside of Newark, New Jersey. And that means as much as, with the Uhuru sums up, they might be nice to their families, but what role do they play, for the state? Mm-hmm. They might be dads to their children, but what roles do they play? He would be there when, so the more I delved into it, he bought, and this is going back 20 years ago, he bought a phone booth in a prison. He put a phone booth in a prison, and he profited $75,000 from one phone booth in one prison. They became multi-millionaires from his own, quote, telecommunications business. Wow. I mean, yeah, it's just, every occupation for white people, is about holding up, a social system. It's all about holding up a social system that has benefited us no end. The wealthiest people on the planet, what we call broke or being poor, there's always social wealth. There's someone you can go to. There's someone, if you really get down and out, that you can go to in your family, among your friends. In the African community, the entire community experiences colonialism, an economic system of colonialism. Everyone else is experiencing the same thing. There is no social wealth, and Ticharwa has really shown how social wealth was prevented from being passed down from one generation to another generation for African communities. And we're getting more and more donations, and I just really want to read them. It's really exciting. Someone named Evan Garner, Asheville?
He's from Asheville.
There's an Asheville in North Carolina? Isn't there? Okay. Yeah. It's not Ashland, Oregon. Okay, Asheville, North Carolina. Evan Garner, $20. Oh, we got wow, thank you, Evan.
We got a whole list.
We got another donation from Casey Mackey, St. Louis, USM, of $20. Marissa Loffer, Seattle, Washington, $25. Incredible. So many people have repeatedly supported this project, have volunteered, have come here, have visited, have seen with their own eyes what Bobby Wittenberg was saying. There's proof in everything you donate. You can see it materialize in progress here in the Black Power Blueprint. Diane Batiste, $100. Incredible. Diane lives in Puerto Rico? Mm-hmm. Diane, we love you. That is incredible, Diane. Thank you so much for your donation and generosity. We only have $135 more to go.
We can do it.
We can do it. We can do it.
I just think it's extraordinary that we have these relatively small donations, which means that everyday people are making this happen.
That's right.
That's
right.
And so the African working class can win. White people who decide to get on the right side of the questions, you have a future as well. And we just, we want to recognize those people.
Uhuru. Can I ask Ticharwa something?
Yeah.
Did you notice, I've noticed that since the Uhuru House opened up and is functioning, there's always police coming around a few days a week to sneakily parking in different places to stop, and stopping African people by the droves at the stop signs. Really? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? That's a specific economy here in St. Louis. the tickets.
Yeah. There's a cop that sits right outside of this building, parked the wrong way on a one-way street, and he just tickets people all day long in a city which I think has more stop signs per square mile or whatever than any place in the world, you know. And somebody said it's almost like the stop signs are there so that they can have a justification to ticket us. And in fact, St. Louis County, which is a separate entity from the city of St. Louis, has 91 or so separate municipalities. And many of those municipalities, and the more you can get information, the more you'll find out. But those municipalities, numerous amounts of municipalities were created as a result of white people wanting to create these white enclaves for themselves. Because if you incorporate into a municipality, then you can write laws, ordinances. And so you can keep, you know, you can put it on the books to keep black people out. You know, whether you are able to state it overtly, or whether you have to mask your intentions. But so you have all of these 91 or so enclaves created. For example, in Blackjack, near where I live now, right at Parker Road, and I forget the side street, there's a set of apartments right there. And in 1971, Blackjack was incorporated by the white people who lived there at the time to prevent that apartment complex from being built, because they didn't want this housing that would draw black people. So they actually incorporated that part of the, you know, that town, and then passed the law, ordinance, saying that this multi-family home could not be built. Eventually it was overturned by the Supreme Court and they were forced to build it. But that is an example. You have even Berkeley was created because white people were kept lobbying to have their own school system separate from the black people in Kinloch, and they couldn't get one, so they incorporated the city of Berkeley. So yeah, so you have these 91 municipalities created. Again, the purpose is to create two economies, one living at the expense of the other. And so one way that they fund this economy at the expense of black people is to place police officers everywhere, all up and down the streets, and to just pull black people over all day long. And Berkeley is interesting because it is the, you know, there's no economic development, because these black people living here now, there's no economic development visible anywhere in Berkeley except the City Hall. It is a beautiful, magnificent center, modernized looking building in this, you know, this backwards looking town. You know, so you have this whole economy, it created off of ticketing black people. So, you know, one way or the other, this system attempts to and does live at the expense of African people. And that is, you know, what's what we call colonialism. You know, and as you stated earlier, racism is not the explanation. You know, there was a military officer on video about a week or so ago, really, you know, mad at his the other, you know, people in the military. I think it was the Navy. You know, really just going off on them because the white soldiers were being racist toward the black soldiers. You know, he wanted all of them not to be racist so that they can go collectively work together to colonize people, which is what the military does. So racism does not address colonialism, which is a material relationship where one people live at the expense of the other. And you can overturn colonialism. You can identify when you are free, when you have your land, labor, and resources back, but you can't tell when you've changed the ideas in white people's heads sufficiently to be free. So we say colonialism. And St. Louis is a colony. The Black Power Blueprint is an anti-colonial project. We do not believe that we can coexist under colonialism. So the Black Power Blueprint is a way for us to contend with white power en route to struggling to destroy white power. So that's what you're supporting. Go to ucaring.com/Black Power Blueprint and make a donation.
$135 more to go, and we've got to make it. Go online, friends watching, please, because we also cannot coexist with colonialism.
That's right.
We cannot coexist with colonialism because the oppressed peoples of the world are fighting back, and there's just no way. Material conditions are changing every day. I even think about another cousin who worked for his in-laws' business all his life, and they have the biggest flower distribution center in Newark, New Jersey, and they distribute flowers all over the New York area. But where do those flowers come from? Kenya. Wow. Kenya and Hawaii. And Kenya has such a history of incredible resistance, from the Kenyan Land Freedom Army in the 1950s to organizing today in the Uhuru movement. They want the Black Power blueprint in Kenya. This is coming. This is the future. Colonized people having control of their own economies, their own land. The land will be used for what they want and need the land to be used for, not for parasitic colonizers coming in, having second homes and doing big game hunting or growing flowers so white people in New Jersey can live a wealthy life. You know, and even we talk so much about the aluminum here that was used for the, you know, heating and air conditioning. That's Ghana. That's Ghana. And the Black Panther Party was very clear about that, because Kaiser Corporation, that controls all the aluminum in Ghana, you know, that makes Kaiser aluminum foil that we wrap grilled food in and stuff. You know, that's a big corporation in Oakland, and they participated in the 25-year plan. They were never going to want to have Africans have power, you know, in that city. That is the struggle. And we have to participate in that struggle as white people through reparations. We have to pay reparations for the Black Power blueprint. It's the most incredible vision of a positive future that we could ever have. In fact, giving reparations is downright liberating. Sometimes people early on would say, well, what do you feel, guilty? And we'd say, well, one is guilt is an honest emotion. To be honest with you, there's nothing wrong with that if there's something you have done that has to be rectified, but the idea is to rectify it, because there's nothing more liberating than this worldview that has been handed to white people, because reparations actually gives us a way to live with dignity, you know, and integrity, you know, and be able to hold our head up, you know, to know that we actually have a concrete way that we stand in solidarity with the right of African people to independence, to an independent economy, to power, to actually having power, African workers' power over their lives and communities. That has been the greatest gift we have been ever given as a people. I can honestly say that.
Wow. Uhuru.
So that is reparations. Yes, yes. Uhuru.
Yes, yes, yes.
Uhuru.
So we got more time? Or are we wrapping up?
Well, we are wrapping up.
Is okay?
Yeah, we're
Okay.
wrapping up.
So how far are we from our goal, I guess?
We are $135.
Okay. We want to make
That's
that
it.
goal before we
wanna
wrap
make the
up.
goal.
You know? So we just really want to urge people to continue to donate. You know, a little bit more about the conditions right now in St. Louis. You have this National Geospatial Spy Agency coming. And you have a city right now where the white ruling class is worried because there are a number of conditions, you know, that don't allow them to generate wealth and to do so at our expense. You know, they've lost, the city has had its credit rating reduced 3 times in the last 4 years. Really? It's running an annual deficit. The school system just temporarily got received its accreditation back. They have a shrinking population. There was 867,000 or so people in the city of St. Louis in 1950. Is now down to 200-something thousand. Wow. So they have this, and then they have this highly politicized African community. You know, so they're attempting to solve all of these problems at our expense. So they've put forth this attempt to allow people who don't live in the city of St. Louis to work in the city of St. Louis, primarily so that they can bring white people into the police force to police African people, so that then they can make it comfortable for white developers, colonizers. They've put forth this bill to reduce the number of wards. And, you know, of course, we see gentrification everywhere. So, and then you have all of these organizations that, in response partially to this rebellion that happened in Ferguson, where people were saying, you know, we're standing up and fighting for, you know, they were saying kill the black people as the front for this co-optation of this African struggle. So you have all of these conditions, and then you have the Black Power Blueprint.
That's it.
Then you have the Black Power Blueprint, where we are going to you, to get $10, $15, $25, and Kitty is going to read some more.
We just got a wonderful $20 donation from Zion Farmer, one of our presenters tonight. All right, Zion.
All right.
All right, Zion. That's only $115 more to go. Zion is 8 years old? 9 years old. Absolutely. I really thought 10, but then I thought that was too much. Then I went down to 8. All right, Zion, that's powerful. Powerful. Yeah. African self-determination. That's the youth. That's the future. Yes, Uhuru. Only $115 more to go. A lot of times in the white community, people spend that on a weekend, without a doubt. In a day. Restaurants, whatever. Having a nice day on the weekend. $115 more to go to make a $1,000 goal.
And you can go to youcaring.com/Black Power Blueprint. We also want you to go to our Facebook page so that you can click that little bell button so that you can get notifications when we go live. And you can follow the Black Power Blueprint through phase 2 and phase 3.
Do we have any more donations coming?
Yeah, Pete Yarshuk.
How much?
20.
All right.
95 to go.
All right. Pete Yarshuk, San Francisco, California, made a $20 donation to the Black Power Blueprint. That's reparations.
We talked about phase 1 and phase 2, but phase 3 of the Black Power Blueprint consists of a 4,500 or so square foot building that we've purchased. If you're from St. Louis, right at Natural Bridge and Goodfellow.
Yes.
Referred to by the African community as the old boathouse. That will be a commercial kitchen and bakery / cafe that we will renovate. It will also have we will also have a workforce program for African people returning home from these prison systems who can't find an option to even be able to make an honest living. You'll be able to come here. You'll be able to get training, and you can become a cook or a chef. You can start your own catering business. So that is phase 3. Let's just say you're a catering company. You need a commercial kitchen to work out of. You have one. And then you have the One Africa, One Nation market, which is part of phase 2 we're working on now, that you can come to and sell your goods. And if you happen to be an African returning from prison, we also have housing that we can provide for you. So we are really addressing the needs of the African community and winning. The African community is winning through the Black Power Blueprint. Yeah. Uhuru.
And I really need a total of how much more we have to go. 80 more to go. Incredible. Really appreciate the donors tonight, and to say, not to dismiss what we have donated in any way, but reparations, we need to raise millions in reparations. If the resources were there, the Black Power Blueprint could compete with corporations that are coming from other countries, with developers from the white community right now that are snapping everything up. This whole area could be purchased and it could be developed by African tradespeople, African contractors for the African community. I mean, it's just what's powerful happening with the Black Power Blueprint here. And it's always a question of resources. It's a question of resources. We have to really reverse the flow of resources. Every time we give $1 in reparations, we are taking it from, we have removed it from a colonial economic, political economy. That's the power of every dollar one gives in reparations. And we just got another $15, no, we got $15 from Mara. Do you have a last name?
Ratu.
Mara Ratu, Boston.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much, Mara. That's $65 more to go. $65 more to go. So, hopefully people will get online,
you can, even after the event is over, you can still go to youcaring.com/Black Power Blueprint.
Yes.
And you can still make a donation. So we're not giving up. We'll look for that donation even after the webinar if we don't get it right now.
All right, great.
But we want to thank everybody for participating. Again, we want to just give an absolute salute to Chairman Omali Yeshitela, to Deputy Chair Owners Zane Yeshatella, to the entire Black Power Blueprint Steering Committee, to all of the volunteers who volunteer through N2U, through to the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, the African People's Solidarity Committee and Uhuru Solidarity Movement. And we just want to say thank you, and we want to say Uhuru!